Hi, AP kids. Yep, it's getting close. Almost time for the AP exam. We're just a couple weeks away. And hey, in a day or two, probably tomorrow actually, today is Tuesday, by the way, we'll be sharing some more information from AP about the exam itself. But today we're going to talk about culture, art, ideas, and intellectual stuff from the 19th century. And, I'm here with my COVID-19 coping kit. Yes, that's how I get by grading things while sitting staring at a screen all day here in my fortified bunker, fortified with books, coffee, and the occasional sugary snack. But without further ado, let's jump into what's going on intellectually in the 19th century. And I want to begin by reminding you of something that I said to you before in class, and that is there's three basic views in Western culture that we can see. And the 19th century is when the two modern views really come to the forefront. The roots go back to the 16 and 1700s, and of course, everything goes back to the ancient Greeks, so I suppose we could take it all the way back, but we're not going to do that. We're looking at the 19th century. But the 19th century is when two views really come to the forefront. Two views that are secular. One of the themes in European history is the increasing secularization of European culture. And of course, what's secular mean? It means worldly. What's that mean? In contrast to a view that God is what matters most. So, of course, for a long time, that was the view that dominated Western culture. And of course, still a powerful view today in some parts of Western culture. The idea that God matters, humans are the image of God, although fallen. So, man is in the image of God, but also capable of doing evil. Truth is an absolute, and reason is efficient. It's useful. It's not the only way to know things, but it's a good way to know things, based on the assumption that a reasonable God gave humans reason and created a universe in a reasonable way. And so that's theism in a nutshell. But as we said in the 19th century, some prominent thinkers are going to articulate worldviews that are very different than theism. And they're drawing on things that happened earlier. So, quick overview, then we'll dive into the details. The first of those secular worldviews is modernism. We can give it a lot of names: humanism, naturalism, and so on. But modernism is the phrase that the AP curriculum uses, and it's a pretty good phrase. The modern view is that everything is physical. There is no spiritual, or at least if there is spiritual, it's something that we can't ever know about anyway. This goes back to the idea of Descartes that truth is dual or divided into spiritual and physical. But what that really meant for Descartes is that truth was into opinion, subjective, spiritual, not really knowable, personal, private, don't talk about it, and public, objective, rational, provable, empirical. Of course, Descartes' idea was the intellectual launching pad for the Enlightenment. And thanks to the ideas of Locke and Newton, the Enlightenment is where this modernist view that humans are on their own in the universe with their reason to figure out how the machine of nature works was a view that, if not dominant with all people, was very popular with some elites. But the Enlightenment view had no explanation for how anything got here in the first place. It was a worldview with a gaping hole. And many people said, well, then we'll use God as a clockwinder. That's deism. God created the rational machine universe and then left and is not involved and not really significant. And as far as God goes, we can't know anything about him because he's outside of our physical experience. And so that was deism. But that didn't satisfy a lot of people. It was kind of a lame view of God. It was a lame explanation. And it didn't really satisfy people. I mean, generally people who want to get rid of God wanted to get rid of him altogether, and people who didn't want to get rid of God thought that was a pretty vanilla God. So this view putters along until the arrival of Charles Darwin. And so Darwin's Origin of Species was not just a work of biology, but for many people, it filled in the gaps in the record for a complete worldview that matter matters. Humans are only matter, are only material. Truth is absolute, and reason is sufficient. It's all you need. And in fact, in this, instead of priest, scientist would lead us into a brave new world. Many modernists early on were rather optimistic, although today perhaps maybe some of them are more pessimistic, although not all of them. Um, and so there's this idea that humans could save themselves from their problems, that all human problems are material. This was a whole world view, whether Darwin meant it to be or not. The third view also gets its beginning during the Enlightenment, the ideas of Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Now, Rousseau pushes back against the worship of reason, and his ideas come to full flower in the last decade of the 1700s and the first couple decades of the 1800s. And that's what we're going to really begin our focus on in this lecture. These are the Romantics. For them, nothing is true, or whatever I say is true. And by the way, both of those work. If nothing is true, then I get to declare what truth is, because who's going to contradict me if nothing's true? Or nothing's true and I might as well just make up my own truth. Either way, I become the center of the epistemological universe. Humans are free creatures of an undetermined quantity or quality. They may be spiritual, they may not. Truth is relative, not absolute. And this is the part that gives modernists the heebie-jeebies when they talk to romanticists. Although modernists and romanticists are generally rather secular, they disagree on epistemology. Voltaire, for example, said that Rousseau made him feel like crawling on all fours. For the Romantic, reason is insufficient. Oh, it's okay to have around for doing practical things, but for life's big questions, it doesn't cut it. Truth is found through intuition and emotion. One last thing on the timeline before we dive into the details and the artistic expressions that came out of this is that there's a back and forth between these three worldviews. For instance, if we go back to the 1700s, Christianity experiences, at least in Protestant countries, a great awakening in the 1720s and 30s. But that's followed by the thriving Enlightenment, both in France and in Scotland, in the latter half of the 1700s. There's another revival in the late 17 and early 1800s that happens at the same time as the beginning of the Romantic movement. And yet another major revival in Victorian England and the United States in the late 1800s. But it's also in the late 1800s that Darwin's ideas appears. In fact, even before Darwin, the idea of modernism was experiencing a revival with thinkers like Auguste Comte and the realist artists. And that extends all the way to World War I. And Romanticism makes a comeback in the 1890s with thinkers like Friedrich Nietzsche or the decadent art movement in Vienna. And after World War I continues as people lose faith in God and reason and science. And the ideas of Romanticism get a reboot with the existentialist of the early 20th centuries, some of the nihilistic thinking, and all the way into the modern era with postmodernism. Now, we're not going to do 20th century history in this series because that's where the AP exam is not going to go. But these are three ideas are still around today in various forms and with different strengths in various parts of Western civilization and beyond. All right, so let's dive into some details. Let's look at a little more detail at Romanticism. What makes the Romantic happy? And hey, we're all looking for the good life. So one might think of philosophy that way. How do you get to a good life? And for the Romantic, it's through radical individualism. It's through creativity. Man is essentially good. He may be oppressed, and that's a big theme in Romanticism, throwing off the oppression of cultural expectations or tradition or religion or aristocracy or the government or just the man. And that's a very artsy way to think. Guess what? In Romanticism, the artist is the hero. In modernism, it'd be the scientist or the expert or the intellectual. Not that there weren't romantic intellectuals, but you get the idea. It's more about creativity and individuality. If man is essentially good, how could any rules apply? As the American romantic, aka transcendentalist, Emerson said, that you should just be true to yourself. And so this challenges traditional elites. They also value intuition and emotion. And that could be personal intuition. It could also be corporate intuition, which is expressed through culture and art. And this connects to nationalism, where the nation was the expression of the common feeling of all of us Germans, or all of us Italians, or all of us Poles, or whatever. That one's for you, Tyler. And so, also in a limited way, this caused some romantics who were pushing back against the trends of Western civilization to admire non-Western culture. There's a fascination with Egypt and the East and India, and later on with Paul Gauguin, with the Impressionists, the fascination with Pacific Island culture and so on. This goes back to Rousseau's idea that native primitive people, and pardon the language, but that's their language, were actually more enlightened because they were closer to nature and not corrupted by civilization. This idea of the noble savage, which of course we can tear to pieces later, but that's the idea. Or the idea that Eastern cultures were somehow less rational and more sensual. And remember, sensual is a good thing for these guys, that rational is a bad thing. That rational is about being cold and calculating and without a heart, right? So the head and the heart thing going on. They value the experience of nature, not the dissection, but the experience of nature. They valued the supernatural, but not in traditional sense, although some poets like William Blake were religious, but more in the idea of mystery. And so it's the romantics who invent the horror genre. Remember Frankenstein or Edgar Allan Poe in America, neo-Gothic architecture like Neuschwanstein, which you can see in the picture there, located down below me. And then finally, there is this reaction against the industrialization and enlightenment, right? And lots of nature paintings like this one from Constable, okay? And of course, we see Delacroix's famous painting, Liberty Leading the Peoples, celebrating one of the many French revolutions and the idea of revolution being a good thing. So if we look a little more at Romantic art, we can see that again, looking at the AP language, that they tended to emphasize emotion, nature, intuition, individuality, and occasionally also nationalism, such as when we look at Goya's very famous painting here, set during the Spanish resistance to Napoleon, and we can see him using light and symbolic Christian images to make a hero out of the guerrilla fighter being executed by the French, who are kept faceless. And this is a nationalistic painting. I mentioned Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's book in which industry creates the monster. We see the naturalistic paintings of people like Constable and J.M.W. Turner in England. That's J.M.W. Turner and John Constable. There should be a comma there. And of course, also the German painter Caspar David Friedrich. You see his painting here with the monks in the ruined cathedral. We're also seeing the writings of people like Goethe, Wordsworth, the poet, Mary Shelley, Victor Hugo, Hunchback of Notre Dame, and so on. All right. By the 1830s, there was a new emphasis on reason and science, and this goes to some social thinkers like Auguste Comte, who invented sociology. His argument that all human problems are not problems of the spirit or morality, but rather problems of environment. And again, he's writing this long before Darwin. So Darwin is really the end of the modernist story, not the beginning. The beginning would go back to the Enlightenment. But positivism, which is Comte's idea and continues with thinkers like Bertrand Russell and H.G. Wells in the 19th and 20th century, is that science alone can provide knowledge, that science has the only right to speak truth. Sigmund Freud will voice this as well. And so that human affairs, what we call social studies or social science, these things should be studied with the same methods as medicine or biology. Now, of course, Darwin arrives on the scene with his 1859 Origin of Species and his other blockbuster work, the 1871 Descent of Man, which deals more specifically with human evolution. Of course, not everybody liked that, as you can see from the 19th century political cartoon down below my talking head. Hopefully you get the reference if you go back a couple lectures to Wilberforce's abolitionist advertisement. But Darwin's evolutionary theory really opens up questions about human nature, about ethics, and it encourages this rise of secularism. Darwin has never just been a scientific discussion. It's always been much, much bigger than that. All I have to do is listen to people who argue for evolution like Richard Dawkins and various other people who are out there debating these things. They very quickly get into politics and ethics and so on, social policy. So that was apparent right from the get-go, and everybody knew it, which is why it was so controversial. And so what's embedded in evolutionary theory, whether Darwin articulated it clearly or not, is the idea that conflict and struggle is the road to progress. Social Darwinists are really going to jump on that idea. Do ethics exist at all? Is there any such thing as right and wrong if we're simply accidentally evolved creatures in a godless universe? Do lions worry about the ethics of ripping the throat out of the gazelle? And there's this idea, wait a minute, if we're animals, if we're merely matter, then are we really freely thinking? This is determinism, that what appears to me to be free thought and free action is simply following the hardwired rules of nature, whether that be through my environmental programming, my genetic programming, or some chemical thing that's going on inside this walking bag of chemicals. Darwin's theories inadvertently, and we say inadvertently to let Darwin a little bit off the hook, justified eugenics, racism, and the general concept of social Darwinism, that humans who do well because they're more evolved. Nothing personal, just winners and losers. And if you're a loser, too bad. Um, Now, we can let Darwin mostly off the hook, although he does say some typically Victorian racist things. But the hardcore racism, the Aryan supremacy bit, eugenics, those would go to other people, including his cousin Francis Galton, the inventor of eugenics. His good friend Herbert Spencer thought that rich people were simply more evolved, and proved it through statistics of sociology, or at least he thought he proved it. Again, something that later intellectuals would tear apart. Karl Marx tried to be scientific. In fact, one of his great essays outside of his two famous books is called Scientific Socialism, where he says, look, evolution proves that humans as a herd are evolving and progressing into something different. And of course, Marx said, I know what the next step is. It's communism. So everybody kind of wanted the piece of the Darwin action to justify their theories. What Darwin thought about all this, we have, some letters, but the man was a biologist and didn't publicly at least wade into too many of these arguments. So during this time period, again, art reflects the trend. And this is the rise of realism, where artists thought that their job was now to represent reality, and to do that in a way that sometimes challenged elites. And so we see Daumier's third-class carriage here up top in this engraving, where he says, look, the common man is the person that we should be concerned about, because that's the backbone of what really makes things tick. We see this in the writings of Dickens. We see it in the writings of Émile Zola. We see it in the paintings here by Daumier, The Gleaners by Gustave Courbet, and the road crew here. The Gleaners is by Millet, Jean-Francois Millet. And then Gustave Courbet, this is his painting here, The Road Breakers. That these people, the common folks, the poor, the guy who makes the roads, these are the people who build civilization. Now, ironically, science leads us back to sort of a darker version of Romanticism, if you will, to this idea that humans are essentially irrational. I mean, think about it. If we're just animals and we're not freely thinking, then everything we do is not rational. It's simply, I'm operating on instinct. I'm operating on instinct right now. I think I'm doing this rationally, but I'm just doing what I'm programmed to do. Very elaborate smokescreen of rationality to following my social or genetic programming. So that's one way to look at it, and probably the way that somebody like Sigmund Freud, who you see below, down directly below me, might think about things. Of course, Friedrich Nietzsche thought that this was just the way things were. He says, there are no such thing as facts. Everything we believe is basically filtered through what we want to be true. And that's okay. Assert your will. Look, if things are evolved, the universe is random, it's all chaos. And frankly, scientists probably don't know what they're talking about too much either. We're never going to figure this all out. So just make your own truth and assert your will through power. And whatever you say is true, it can make happen through will. That's true. And so Nietzsche, it brings back this idea of romanticism, that it's about what we intuit, what we emote, and that reason is less valuable than emotion. And for him, the prime emotion is the will to power. Now, again, some scientists said, wait a minute, I don't think we're that, completely irrational. Freud, after all, said, well, we should try to restrain our irrationality. Although Freud concluded at the end of World War I that we were hopeless, that essentially humans in general would mostly be irrational, and that we could use reason to sort of suppress it as best we can. Einstein, thought that people used his theories to justify relativism in all things. Uh, and he didn't like that. He said, no, I'm just talking about atoms. But the discovery that the Newtonian universe was not quite as orderly and machine-like, that our very building blocks of atoms function according to quantum theory, which is essentially built in part on randomness, that we cannot predict a lot of things the way we thought we could. Remember, the predictive value of science is what made it so powerful. And so Einstein's theory of relativity, that the observation of truth depends on the position of the observer, and Max Planck's quantum theory really rattled people, even if Planck, who was a Christian, and Einstein, who was more of a deist and very much a believer in rationality, even if they said, no, that's not what we're saying. But history is full of thinkers who say one thing and then people who run off in different directions with their ideas. And Freud's ideas, of course, undermine the idea that we were rational, that yes, you have a rational part of your brain, but there's this much more powerful subconscious part underneath the surface. There's a wizard behind the curtain, the wizard of your id. Yeah, okay. So a little bit of art to wrap things up here. And so late 19th and early 20th century art reflected this departure from reason and this valuing of intuition and following your emotions, as art becomes less and less realistic and more about whatever the artist wants truth to be. In fact, the whole idea of art up and through the realist movement was that art should share values, that art should hold up truth and beauty, and things that we need to be taught. But from the Impressionist onward, artists begin to move away from that view of art and say that art is what the artist wants it to be, or perhaps even what the viewer wants it to be. And so less and less stable as to defining what art is. And famously today, most people would say that art is in the eye of the beholder. It begins with the Impressionist, moves through the post-Impressionists or Expressionists, and then into modern art with abstract and surreal and cubist art. You're not going to need to know those in great detail, but recognize that these later forms of art emphasize the subjective, the abstract, and the expression of the artist. And they were often meant to provoke rather than elevate artists. In fact, the Impressionists themselves were rejected by the French Art Academy and put on their own art show, the Salon des Refusés, in order to even be seen. In other words, they went against the established definition right from the beginning. People like Claude Monet, whose painting of the famous water lilies, which he was sort of obsessive about, the play of light and color we see there in this painting. We see people like Picasso and the prostitutes of Avignon, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, not only cubist, but showing prostitutes as an object of art. We see Gauguin's painting here, the reclining female nude, a classical piece of art, but in this case scandalous because she was from Tahiti, where Gauguin spent many years, fathered many illegitimate children, and apparently left a little trail of syphilis wherever he went. Yeah, not a great guy, Gauguin. And then Van Gogh, the disturbing but brilliant Dutchman with his Starry Night. Well, I hope you've enjoyed this lecture, and I hope it's helping you get ready for the exam and you've reviewed some of the big ideas. We've got one more lecture to go as we wrap up our review lectures, and then we'll spend the last few days and last couple of weeks looking more intently at how we exactly are going to tackle the DBQ. Till then, take care.